Andy Refkin here, catching up with Dave McConville, who I first met, I believe, in Asheville, North Carolina, which is the epicenter for the highest mortality from this extraordinary inland impact of Hurricane Helene, which was pretty potent when it hit the coast of Florida, Category 4. But it hit a very sparsely populated part of Florida. So the coastal losses are big, but not nearly what they could have been if it had hit Tampa, for example. But when this storm system moved inland, carrying epic amounts of water in the atmosphere, it deposited that water all across the southeast, pretty much, and very far from the coast in regions like the western part of the Carolinas, North and South Carolina, where the landscape is deeply corrugated, lots of hills and vales. And, you think about the hollers and of Appalachia, that's it. And so this water coming down at these rates, I think one of the highest rates was 22 inches in 24 hours, creates just unbelievable damage. And we've seen that play out. It's still playing out. Sadly, the total death count across the region is like close to 120. I'm sure it's going to come higher. But 30 of those deaths, there were more deaths in the counties surrounding Asheville than in the entire state of Georgia, which I think was at 25. And so lots of emerging lessons to explore here, not just in recovery, but how do we, as I've put it, build forward safer? It's not about building back. And if we just build back, we're hostages to designs of the past and community patterns of the past that can't live in with today's extreme events, let alone what could come with as global warming intensifies. Dave McConville is a data visualizer and much more, who's been working for a long time, as he was when I met him in Asheville, on trying to present data to people in ways that actually can change what we do, instead of just clicking and going, oh, gee, that's cool. And you call it user experience, you can call it whatever you want, but it's a hard frontier. I've done several sessions on Sustain What that talk about big number numbness, and how do you actually change behavior or foster change with these technologies that we use. So David, first of all, it's good to see you again. You're now out in Oakland, California, but you still work on this kind of arena. But I want to take you back to Asheville, just briefly let people know, your history in that region. And you had been through in 2004, I believe, there was another round of epic flooding from a hurricane. So just tell us a little bit about that, the North Carolina part of you, and then we'll get into where we go from here.
Sure. Hi. Yeah. Thanks for having me. I was in Asheville. I moved there originally to go to college, actually, in 1989, and so I was there for many decades. And it was through my work with visualization that I got very interested especially after the 2004 flood, which wasn't as bad as the one that everyone just experienced, but it was pretty bad. And there was a task force assigned by the city and the county to examine what happened, and to present findings and recommendations to minimize the impact and the dangers for next time. And I was working closely with a group, the National Environmental Modeling and Analysis Center. Asheville, of course, is the headquarters for the National Climatic Data Center. So it's where a lot of people that pay a lot of attention to the climate are. And with this group, NEMAC, which was out of UNC Asheville, my company, the company that I co-founded, Illuminati, makes immersive visualization domes and displays, worked with NEMAC to visualize the geography of the region. And we created a center downtown where NEMAC had one of our domes and displays, and we would invite decision makers in. And the goal of this visualization was to help them to understand the interactions between geology and hydrology in particular, to gain a greater sense of why we live in a place that was so prone, or that is so prone, to these types of extreme events. And
Right.
that a lot of times, people talk about watersheds and the dynamics of how water works within these types of geographies, and aren't necessarily, everybody's not holding the same image in their mind, right?
Right.
That specialists have strong views on these things, but then you try to communicate that to a policymaker that might not have any idea why developing on a steep slope is bad, or why should we be harming the economy by not letting people build in the floodplain. These are just things that people come from radically different life experiences. So we made this animation to really focus on helping to explain some of the basics around where the watersheds and reservoirs were around Asheville, what the nature of impervious surfaces are, and to
Right.
simulate some of the flooding that happened along the Swananoa River and Swananoa River Road in Biltmore Village back in 2004.
Yeah, so I'm going to play it. I have the music turned down, so it's just be the video. And again, this reminds me of Arizona State had been working on a decision theater. There's been various efforts along these lines over the last couple of decades to bring data to decision makers in ways that can change. So let's go back. This is back in 2009-ish.
Yep.
And
It was shortly after the recommendations came out in 2007 from the
Right.
task force. And then shortly after that, we started working on it.
So here we go. So just give us a bit of a voiceover of what we're thinking about here.
Sure. Yeah. This is kind of flying in over some of the, GIS data that we had imported into an animation package to introduce some core concepts. So this first part is really just, the absolute basics, that rain falls, it flows down, and this is how water accumulates, which seems almost laughably basic, but it's actually really important in terms of communicating to a general populace that might not have given a lot of thought to this. And this is where we're defining the nature of a watershed, also called catchments in other parts of the world,
Right.
to examine how all the water accumulates, how it flows, the different water bodies that we refer to, talking about the nature of a reservoir, where the big one outside of Asheville is the North Fork Reservoir that provides the drinking water for Black Mountain, Swananoa, Asheville, and then a brief description of what impervious surfaces are. And so we just flying into a simulated neighborhood here, and it's basically all these places that are concretized, that are paved, where water can't permeate into the soils, right?
Right.
And so this is where we get to fly over into the town from I-40, coming from the east, going west. And you see Black Mountain here, North Fork Reservoir off to the right, and we're flying in, and you see the pink areas start to come up, these red areas, as impervious surfaces. And the point being that as these increase, they yield more runoff, they cause more flooding downstream, they create more dangerous conditions. And here we are coming into downtown Asheville, the cut in the Tunnel Road, Asheville Mall, and then that blue line is where we are now in Biltmore Village. So this is coming up Swananoa River to simulate the extent of the flooding during the 2004 flood. This is the Swananoa River Road.
Right, which has been devastated this
time
around.
Yeah, exactly. So this is exactly where a lot of the people are seeing the pictures coming from right now.
Right.
And a big part of the findings of the task force was, being able to help the decision makers understand the dynamics of impervious surfaces development and flooding. And, this exacerbates the danger. And here we see the McDowell Street Bridge, and kind of some of the most famous shots from this past weekend's events that I've seen, at least repeated over and over, are of a Precision Tune and a Wendy's in Biltmore Village, which are actually like just over this bridge in this shot, or just to the right, actually. And Biltmore Village is off to the left. But, people are seeing the footage of these places. That is the reason that we decided to visualize this particular scene, because this was the most prone to flooding, and sure enough, that's what happened again.
Right, and you can see there that was 18 inches of rain over 5 days, and in this case, at least in some of the very heaviest rainfall areas, it was like more than 20 inches of rain in one day.
Yeah.
So really epic stuff.
And I think so. One of the things that I've noticed too in the reporting is people are actually starting to report on CFMs, which registers the flow of the water and the intensity of the flow, the cubic feet per
Right.
minute. And I think that's one of the things that we don't really get across in this. We think about flooding as just things slowly rising, but when you're dealing
Right.
with rivers, you're dealing, some of the footage that's coming out is the intensity of the flow that's breaking the bridges and things are, piling up. And here we have some of the recommendations that are all just very simply like, how do we mimic the natural water cycle? How do we limit
Right.
the impervious surfaces? How do we maximize the amount of trees and plants? How do we create, soils that can absorb and floodplains that, really limit the damage?
Right.
And so this video was 15 years ago, right?
Right.
And obviously the 2004 flood was 20 years ago. And
Right.
one of the things that we would talk a lot about is like, the 1,000-year flood is now every 100 years, the 100-year floods are now every
Right.
10 years. And so this was definitely one of those like 1,000-year flood events that turns out, it's sort of the equivalent of what happened back in 1916, probably even a bit worse.
Yeah. And one thing that strikes me all the time is even among environmentally concerned folks these days, when an event like this happens, so everyone is so desperate to make the discussion about climate change, the change in the storm from the changing climate, from carbon dioxide buildup in the atmosphere, that they don't always get to the point that changes in the landscape, not just where people live, but as you say, how much is hemmed in, how much is paved over, can also greatly exacerbate the flood. So the rain is one thing,
Yeah.
but the flood is another thing. But that requires us to be thinking about two things at once. Is that part of the problem, do you think?
Is it a problem to get over binary logic in the Western mind? Yeah. Like,
Yeah.
yeah, I honestly, most of the work that we do focuses on microclimates and water,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
because water has a huge role, not just within flooding, but within the role of regulating microclimates, right? And so
Right.
the attention on climate change immediately goes to the global and to anthropogenic causes, which is all right and good, but insufficient. And that there's a lot that is being disrupted in terms of the landscape, in terms of local water cycles and what are sometimes called small water cycles that are radically disrupting the ability, not just for carbon storage, but for the ability for all of these natural cycles to actually, absorb and regenerate and be resilient in the way that, paving over things takes away. And it's really, I think, for us now and the work that we're doing, really critical to be examining how it is we have degrees of agency over our local landscapes, over our local places, over sort of local climates, so that even as the exasperated events because of global climate are becoming more extreme, that we can be thinking about what does it mean to harden our places. Obviously in a case like this, it's so extreme, like no amount of sort of green infrastructure was going to stop stop a lot of this, but there are things we
Right.
can do to really prepare for it and to think longer term in terms of how we're developing in floodplains, how much the surfaces are being made impervious, how much people are just being mindful of the dynamics of the interconnections and the relationships between human communities and settlements and people
Right.
downstream. There's a lot to consider, and definitely like needs to be more than just thinking about and blaming it all on CO2. There's a lot of things happening.
Yeah, and this also gets to what you were just saying, gets to just preparedness generally for, when you have a severe flood, as you said, if it's bad enough, you're not going to, you could have a spongy city, you're still going to overwhelm the system.
Yeah.
And that gets to like evacuation plans and for people, communities to be sufficiently attuned to the information that they know, hey, it's time to get away from the river.
Yeah.
And I did see, I tweeted about this morning. I can't remember. It's probably too hard to pull up the tweet, but there was at least one river there where on the 25th, people were evacuating, which is like 2 days ahead. And I thought I got to look into that because someone got the message and their house is gone, but they're alive. And you know, to have 30 deaths in one county implies some significant inquiries really need to be made to see what went wrong and how to make the inevitable the response, you know, better the next time. The other thing, of course, is history. You know, I showed a minute ago. I was showing Citizen Times, this small newspaper in Asheville, is doing a really good job covering this epic disaster in the community. But they also several years ago, they ran a wonderful pictorial about 1916. I was writing about this earlier on social media, when two hurricanes, one from the Gulf came through in July, and within 5 days, another came in from the Atlantic. And the combination, then you had super sodden ground, and you're adding many inches of rain on top of it. And it was epically, additionally disastrous. Many deaths. And I think the death count is actually similar to what we're seeing now. And that gets to another thing, you know, how can we build into community awareness some reality about the deep history, the history of the landscapes around them, that, you know, this isn't all new. It's not unprecedented in the sense that there are and have been and can be and will be significant hurricane impacts there. There have been, you know, 100 years ago. And
What's
so
the
it's not like this is, oh my God, what just happened? This is a
yeah,
fundamentally new thing.
what's the equivalent of the tsunami stones in Japan? You
Oh
know,
my God, which
like,
I agree with.
like
Yeah.
how do we have the continuity of memory?
Yeah.
And I think that's just something that every place needs to be asking now, because as people are thinking about how to be in right relationship with places and recognize the dynamics that are inherent there for all kinds of reasons, you know,
Yeah, I know.
it's absolutely critical, especially for decision makers, that, you know, some of these laws, they are kind of a pain to tell people they can't build in floodplains, but then this happens, and how much is this going to cost, you know?
Oh my
Like,
God.
what's it
Yeah.
going to be on the back end, reacting to things, versus on the front end, sort of being mindful about what the ultimate damage is going to be by not taking responsibility for understanding these dynamics. It's, you know, the big.
And yeah, and Asheville is sort of a best case scenario to a certain extent, because you have this national climatic data center there. You've got a huge amount of expertise in the community. In that sense, it reminds me weirdly of Norman, Oklahoma, which is where the National Severe Storms Laboratory is, which studies tornadoes.
Mm,
It's 90 miles away from Moore, Oklahoma, which has had 2 EF5 completely devastating tornadoes. And I've written about this too many times. The Moore finally put in some building codes
mm,
requiring, you know, to have a shelter, a safe room in a house. Norman, Oklahoma, where the National Severe Storms Laboratory sits, doesn't yet have those codes. And just because it's 90 miles away doesn't mean that the
yeah,
same kind of epic destruction can't happen there. So
yeah.
here's where I say to people like you got a lot, you know, it's a great opportunity and a great challenge. And I'm glad there's efforts to work on this.
I mean, it is well, I mean, the work that our studio is doing now is in Los Angeles, which a lot of this applies in the same way.
Mm-hmm.
Daniel Swain had a great thread on this recently around kind of the lessons of this for the understanding of the next arc storm in California, you know, and
Right.
the degree to which a lot of the infrastructure that's been put in place is failing, you know, with regards to the extremes of these events. And, you know, I think it was last year the Los Angeles aqueduct busted, you know, that had been going for 100 years, right? And so and then you're seeing what almost happened with Lake Lure Dam, but some of the other dams in Tennessee did break. And so the dangers of these events are radically exacerbated by the degree to which these forces have attempted to be harnessed by this modern infrastructure over the past century, but it's actually exacerbating the danger for us now. And so they're really difficult questions that need to be addressed if we're going to, you know, be able to prepare and mitigate some of the extremes here. And that runs right into a lot of really significant questions around, you know, expenditures and profit motives, and, you know, all the larger paradigmatic things. And that's what we're really finding is it's impossible to have those conversations without this context. Because when you have those conversations without that deep sense of history, without knowing what's come before, without understanding the nature of the place, then they're completely untethered, and you can kind of claim and do anything. But it's very, very important to have a deeper sense of the dynamics of these relationships.
So history matters. History books matter.
I think it's got to be more than books, honestly. I mean, that's what we discovered. It's like we were creating these experiential environments. Like the video that we just saw was actually done for a dome that people would walk inside of and surrounding them, right? And the degree to which anything can be done to help people to have a lived experience of these things. Like, I mean, a lot of the folks we work with, they're in this field because they've experienced this stuff, right? It's not an abstraction. And so how can we, in anticipation, help people to understand things that, aren't necessarily requiring everybody to read long government reports? Like, we have to be able to make it and present it in such a way that it's graspable by people that aren't specialists, and that's the challenge of our time, I think, because we've got amazing specialists in all kinds of agencies doing all kinds of things, but they're isolated in a lot of ways, and we have to be having these more coherent conversations about the nature of what the cumulative effect is.
Yeah, boy, which just again leads to a sense of a lot of work to be done. And I would love to figure out if there's a way, how do you distribute that work so across, let's say, across a watershed, so that communities up and down a watershed, even if it crosses county and state lines, become cognizant of their relationship. There's been good work like this. For example, in Africa, there's a journalism operation called infonile.org, which is, the Nile goes through something like 17 countries, and they're integrating journalism with reporters in the different countries to tell the common stories of what the Nile River issues and opportunities amount to. And if there's a way to do that, I'm just brainstorming here a little bit on where we could take skill sets that you have and that others have, and create the conversations and the visualizations, et cetera, that can make a difference.
I mean, this is one of the reasons that we're working in Los Angeles County, because they've actually been extremely forward thinking about this, that the citizens passed a bond measure to tax pervious surfaces to encourage creating more ability to absorb into the soils. And that tax is being paid for to improve watershed health, or it's paying for new infrastructure to improve watershed health. It's being paid for by the taxes, but it's going out to communities. And LA actually has watershed coordinators, that they've got people working in each watershed, helping the whole watershed understand the nature and dynamics of what they're doing, right? So the idea of watershed governance goes back, centuries. I mean, in many ways, like a lot of indigenous communities, like the boundaries of territories are based on things like watersheds, right? And so this is nothing new. It's just that we've imposed these, sort of imaginary boundaries, political boundaries in municipalities that water doesn't care about. Right. The more we can have a deeper sense of our connectedness within our bioregions, within our watersheds, the more prepared we're actually going to be for having the types of conversations and responses that are going to be increasingly necessary. There was
an artist who was working on the Los Angeles River, that constructed part of the river. I can't remember what her name was.
Yeah, Lauren Bond, at Metabolic Studio. They're doing a lot of work there. And prior to that, there's Helen and Newton Harrison did a significant amount of work over this for many decades. They've actually got a number of shows up in the LA region now. But they were actually, the first time I met Helen and Newton, went to their studio, and they had a whole map of California based on the watersheds and making the case for what would watershed governance look like. And so this is something that a lot of artists and ecologists have been thinking about for many, many years. The entire bioregional movement that was, in many ways catalyzed here in the Bay through Planet Drum. Like, there's been a lot of work around watershed governance, and it was actually a big thing in Western North Carolina too. And so it's not like these faults haven't been thought, and there are deep wells of understanding that can be, tapped into. But I think the question is, how do you change the paradigm that sort of places a higher priority on these political boundaries rather than the actual, natural boundaries of geology and hydrology.
All right. Well, we'll have to do another session to get at this a little bit more. I really appreciate reconnecting with you. And I'm going to close out by showing something just for the heck of it that I'm trying to make a point about. Share screen. Window. Here we go. Yeah, we have the infrastructure bill, the law, and there's a significant amount of money available. And I think getting away from the idea of building back better, building forward spongier.
Yeah, totally.
To me, that's the drive. I'm showing a picture from an actual driveway at the Garrison Institute, kind of a sustainability center in the Hudson Valley, and they had part of it's asphalt and part of it's not asphalt, and part of it's pervious. These words that don't help us very much either.
No, I know. No, trust. Like watershed itself is like calling it a water catchment makes more sense, right?
Yeah, right.
Like that's Basin. A lot. I mean, I look forward to sharing with you what we're releasing in a month, because we've reworded a lot of this stuff and we've made it visual and we've made it interactive, and it's going to be open source so that other communities can adopt it. Right. And it's because it's like hyper specific to localities. But we have education tools specifically for this, about sponge cities, about all the different types of, like, even in green infrastructure, they call them best management practices. We're just calling them remedies. Like we've had to think through like, how do people think about this stuff,
Yeah, best management. That's pretty weird. It's pretty screwed up when you have a phrase like that that's become there's an acronym for it, BMP.
BMP, I know. Like,
it's an acronym for a useless phrase, and it's a useless acronym.
No, so we've gone through 4 years of like questioning all this stuff.
Wow.
And trying to like rethink it and actually redefining the nature of infrastructure. I'd love to share that with you when we're.
Well, we'll do that for sure.
Yeah.
So in the bottom line here too, now just returning back to the areas that were impacted, the more that we can do to help communities just get through this next few weeks and months and years actually is the better. Hopefully it won't become politicized in a bad way. This is a time for politicians to pull together and not use this as a ballot box issue, for example.
Yeah, for sure.
One can hope. I'm not sure.
Good luck with that.
Yeah.
I think that the greatest threat we face is bad faith on the part of politics,
Yeah, I know. So once again, this was 1916, July, the same area that had this epic deluge now. And it'd be great to not have to repeat this cycle. The rain is inevitable. The disaster is not inevitable. As many of my friends in disaster research, there's even a hashtag, no natural disaster.
Yeah.
There's natural rain, there's natural hurricanes, and there's unnatural human influence on some of those systems now. But the impacts, the results are up to us. So thanks, Dave McConville, for coming on Sustain What for the first time. You were on .earth a long time ago.
Yeah, it's good to see you.
And
15 years.
Let's revisit when there's your new work